Good evening. This is Victor Graves. Whether you meant to find us or not, you have tuned your receiver to the lost signal. There are programs that arrive by schedule, and there are programs that arrive by accident. This one, I'm afraid, has always belonged to the second category. We are not listed in your newspaper. We do not announce ourselves between the weather report and the dance orchestra. We come through late, when the house has settled, when the rooms have gone soft around the edges, when a person alone with a radio may begin to feel that the dark is not empty, only patient. People write to me. That is the simplest way to explain it, though not the truest. They write because something happened and no minister could bless it away. No sheriff could put it in a report. No doctor could name it without looking embarrassed. And no family member wanted to hear the story twice. They write because memory, when left alone too long, becomes a kind of room, and some rooms should not be occupied by one person forever. The letters come from farm wives, night clerks, railwaymen, widows, school teachers, nurses, traveling salesmen, children who have grown old, and old men who sound, on paper, very much like frightened boys. Some are written in pencil, some in ink. Some are careful and formal, as though the writer believes good grammar might make the unbelievable more respectable. Others arrive in a shaking hand, with words crossed out and rewritten, as though the truth itself kept changing shape. I do not claim these stories are true. I do not claim they are false. I have found that the distinction offers less comfort than people imagine. A false story can still open the wrong door in the mind, and the true one can be dismissed if it asks too much of us. So I do not ask you to believe. I ask only that you listen. Tonight I have chosen 3 letters for our first broadcast. They do not concern the same town, the same family, or the same year, but each was sent with the same peculiar urgency. Each writer wanted the words removed from their private keeping. Each seemed to understand that some experiences do not end when they are survived. They continue quietly in the telling. The first letter came from a woman named Mrs. Clara Whitcomb, posted from northern Vermont in the winter of 1948. Her note was brief. Mr. Graves, she wrote, I am not a fanciful woman. I have raised 4 children, buried 1 sister, and lived through enough storms to know the difference between wind and a hand at the glass. The rest of her account follows. I knew it was not my husband tapping at the nursery window, because my husband was downstairs holding my hand when we heard it. That is the first thing I need understood. I have told this story before, and people always try to put my husband outside the house. They imagine a prank, a mistake, some ordinary figure standing in the snow with a ladder or a branch or a long pole. But Arthur was beside me at the kitchen table. His right hand was around mine. His left hand was resting on our baby's bottle, warming it near the stove. I remember that clearly because the bottle was glass, and his wedding ring clicked against it when the tapping began. It was January 1947. We lived then on my father's old farm, 6 miles from the nearest village, with a road that vanished under snow every time the weather turned hard. That night the storm had come down like a punishment. The windows were white at the edges. The eaves groaned. Wind drove snow against the east side of the house so sharply it sounded like handfuls of gravel. Our daughter Ruth was 8 months old and asleep in the upstairs nursery. I had just said to Arthur that we might be snowed in until morning, and he said we had wood enough and no reason to worry. Then came the tapping. 3 small taps. Neat. Patient. Not at the kitchen window, not at the door. Above us. Tap, tap, tap. We both looked up at the ceiling. The nursery was directly over the kitchen. I remember the sound moving through the boards, delicate as fingernails on a teacup. Arthur smiled at first, because men will smile at fear before they admit it has entered the house. He said it was the branch of the maple tree brushing the glass. I reminded him there was no maple tree near that side of the house. The old one had come down in the storm of 1938. He said then that it must be ice in the gutter, though the gutter had been torn off in November and never replaced. Tap, tap, tap. This time there was no mistaking where it came from. It was at the nursery window on the second floor, 12 feet above the frozen ground, on the blank north wall where there was no porch roof, no trellis, no drain pipe, and nothing for a man or animal to stand upon. Arthur stood so quickly his chair struck the cupboard behind him. I remember the sound because Ruth woke at that same moment and began to fuss upstairs. Not cry, fuss. A soft, questioning little sound. The noise a baby makes when sleep has been disturbed, but comfort still seems nearby. Then, from outside the nursery window, something whispered her name. Ruth. It was my voice. I am not speaking figuratively. I know my own voice. I heard the little tiredness in it, the same breathy catch I had when I tried not to wake the baby. It whispered her name exactly as I did when I leaned over the crib at night. Ruth. Arthur turned white. Not pale, white. The color left his face so quickly that he looked for one terrible second like an old photograph of himself. He went to the stairs, and I followed. I did not want to, but my child was up there, and there are fears that can stop a mother, and fears that carry her forward like a hand in the back. Halfway up the stairs, the tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. Ruth laughed. That was worse than crying. I would have thanked God if she had screamed, because screaming would have meant she was afraid. But she laughed in that sweet, bubbling way babies do when someone they love bends over them. Arthur whispered, "Stay behind me." He had no weapon. There was a shotgun in the pantry, but neither of us thought to fetch it. That is another detail people question. They say, why did he not get the gun? I can only answer that terror does not always make a person practical. Sometimes it makes the mind very small. Ours had room only for the stairs, the door, the window, and our baby. The nursery door was half open. The room beyond was blue with snowlight. We could see Ruth standing in her crib, holding the rail with both hands. Her little face was turned toward the window. Frost had thickened along the glass, white as lace. At first I saw nothing beyond it, only the churn of snow in the dark. Then something pressed against the pane. Not a face. I want to be careful here. A face has order. Forehead, nose, mouth, chin. This was more like a face remembered badly. A pale flattening against the outside of the window, wide where it should have been narrow, narrow where it should have been wide. The frost melted around it in a wet oval. Ruth laughed again and reached one hand toward it. Arthur crossed the room and snatched her from the crib. The thing outside whispered in my voice, "No." That one word has lived in me for every year since. Arthur shoved Ruth into my arms. "Take her downstairs," he said. But before I could move, the thing spoke again. This time it used Arthur's voice. "Clara." It said my name from beyond the glass, while Arthur stood beside me. My husband made a sound I had never heard from him before. It was not a shout. It was not a sob. It was the small, broken sound of a man who has seen the shape of the world change in front of him. He ran from the room. I heard him down the stairs, heard the pantry door bang open, heard the gun taken from its hooks. I stood in the nursery with Ruth clutched to my chest and watched the window. The thing had moved back. Its shape was gone from the frost, but the melted oval remained. Snow blew across the glass. Then, very slowly, something touched the window from outside with 5 long fingers. Tap, tap, tap. Ruth stopped laughing. Arthur went out through the kitchen door. I heard the storm rush in when he opened it. I heard his boots on the porch. I heard him chamber the shotgun. I wanted to scream for him to come back, but my mouth would not work. I went to the window, though every part of me wanted to run from it, and I looked down into the yard. Arthur stood below, knee-deep in snow, holding the lantern in one hand and the gun in the other. The lantern light swung across the white ground. There were his footprints leading from the porch to the wall. Nothing else. No marks beneath the window. No ladder. No animal tracks. No disturbance in the snow at all. He looked up at me. Then something behind me, inside the nursery, said in Arthur's voice,
"Don't let him back in."
I turned so sharply, Ruth began to cry. The room was empty. The crib, the rocking chair, the small dresser, the rag rabbit on the floor. Nothing else. I looked back out the window. Arthur was still below, staring up. He had not spoken. I could see his breath blowing white from his mouth. I could see the fear on his face. He called up to me, but the wind took the words. Behind me, close to my ear, his voice whispered,
"Clara, please, don't let him back in."
I ran. I do not remember reaching the stairs. I remember only Ruth crying against my shoulder and the smell of cold air below. Arthur came through the kitchen door as I reached the bottom. He was shaking so badly he could barely set the gun against the wall. Snow clung to his coat and eyebrows. He said, "There's nothing out there." I backed away from him. He saw it. The hurt in his face was terrible. I had loved that man since I was 19 years old, and for one moment I did not know if I was looking at him or at something wearing the proper arrangement of him. He said, "Clara, it's me." Ruth screamed, not cried, screamed. She twisted in my arms, reaching away from him with both little hands. Arthur stopped where he was. He looked from her to me, and I saw the hurt turn into fear. He understood then what I had heard upstairs. He did not ask me to explain. We spent the rest of the night in the kitchen with every lamp lit. Arthur sat across from me, not touching me. Ruth slept at last in a laundry basket by my feet. The tapping did not come again. Near dawn, the storm passed, and the house grew so quiet that the ticking of the stove seemed indecently loud. At first light, Arthur went outside. I watched from the kitchen doorway. He circled the house twice. He looked up at the nursery window. He looked at the snow beneath it. Only his footprints marked the yard. Nothing had stood there. Nothing could have stood there. When he came back inside, he went upstairs alone. I heard him move around the nursery. Then he called my name. I found him standing at the window, staring at the glass. The frost had melted in streaks where the morning sun touched it. But on the inside of the pane, low enough for a child to reach, though Ruth had never been out of her crib, there was a handprint, a small, wet handprint. Beside it, written backward in the moisture, were 2 words, "Mother opened." I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself some dream had walked through the house and left only nonsense behind. But 3 weeks later, Ruth began saying her first word. Not Mama, not Dada, open. She said it to the nursery window every night until spring. We moved before the next winter. Arthur never spoke of that night again unless I forced him. And when I did, he would only say, "There are some things that want permission." He died in 1961. Ruth is grown now with children of her own. She does not remember the farmhouse. But when I visited her last Christmas, I woke in the night and heard her youngest boy laughing in his crib. I went to the nursery door and found Ruth already standing there in the dark. She had one hand over her mouth. We both looked at the window. There was no tapping, only frost on the glass, melting slowly in the shape of a hand. There are certain words that belong to childhood so completely that we forget how dangerous they are. Open is one of them. A child says it because the world is still a series of gifts waiting behind doors, boxes, cupboards, and windows. Open means surprise. Open means comfort. Open means mother has come into the room. But adults learn, or ought to learn, that not every closed thing is a cruelty. Some doors are shut in mercy. Some windows are locked by generations of people who discovered, at considerable cost, that invitation is a language older than speech. Mrs. Whitcomb's letter ends there. She included no return address beyond the town postmark, and I have made no effort to find her. Some stories arrive with the clear wish not to be pursued. Our second letter concerns a different kind of opening. Not a window this time, but a line. Those of you young enough to take the telephone for granted may not know the old exchange rooms, the switchboards, the rows of cords and lamps, the women who sat through the small hours connecting one human voice to another across rain, snow, sickness, gossip, accident, and death. It was intimate work, more intimate than most people understood. A switchboard operator knew who called the doctor at midnight, who rang the undertaker at dawn, whose house went silent for weeks, and whose line lit when no living hand should have touched it. This letter was signed Miss Evelyn Hart, formerly of Mason County, Ohio. She wrote, "I am 81 years old now, and I have not answered a telephone after dark since 1949. Here is her account. The first time line 7 lit up, I told myself it was a fault in the board. The second time, I heard the child coughing. I was 19 years old when I took the night position at the Mason Exchange. It was not grand work, but it was respectable. And in a town of 3,000 souls, respectable work for a girl living alone with her widowed mother was not something to turn one's nose up at. The exchange sat above Kessler's Dry Goods, in a long, narrow room that smelled of dust, warm wire, and coffee boiled too many times. By day, 3 operators worked the board. By night, there was only one. That was me. I liked the night shift at first. It had a rhythm. Farmers called before dawn. The doctor's line rang often in winter. The hotel asked for long distance. Husbands called from the station to say they had missed the last train. Sometimes there were quarrels, sometimes emergencies, sometimes lonely old women who pretended they had dialed wrong just to hear another voice answer. I learned not to listen more than duty required, though a person hears things in that work. A sob before a number is given, a pause too long after bad news, a man whispering when his wife is asleep in the next room. Line 7 had no reason to light. It was an old rural line that had once run north out of town toward the Barlow place. The Barlow house burned in 1936, taking Mr. Barlow, his wife, and 2 of their children. One boy survived, though he died of pneumonia before spring. After the fire, the line was cut and never restored. The jack remained on the board because no one bothered removing it. Mr. Bell, our manager, had pasted a little strip of paper beneath it that said, "Disconnected." The paper had yellowed by the time I came to work there. On March 12, 1948, at 2:13 in the morning, the lamp above line 7 flickered. Not fully at first. It trembled, as if some weak current were trying to remember its way through the wire. I sat very still and watched it. Then it burned steady. I told myself it was weather. There had been freezing rain that evening. Lines sagged under ice. Crossed wires made strange things happen. Any operator could tell you that. I plugged in and said, "Number, please." At first, there was only static. Then a small voice said,
Miss?
I pulled back so sharply the cord snapped tight in my hand. It was a boy, young, not more than 6 or 7. He sounded far away, but not because of distance. He sounded as if he had cupped his hands around the mouthpiece and was hiding. I said, "Who is this?" He coughed. It was a deep, tearing cough, too large for his little voice.
Miss, can you send someone? The smoke is in the hall.
I could not speak for a moment. I looked at the strip of paper beneath the jack. Disconnected. Then I said, "Where are you calling from?"
Our house.
"What is your name?"
Samuel.
My fingers went cold. I knew the names from the newspaper clippings. Everyone in town did. The youngest Barlow boy had been named Samuel. I said, "Samuel, listen to me. Is there an adult with you?"
Mama won't wake up.
His voice broke on that, but softly, as if he had already tried crying and found it did not help. I rang Mr. Bell at his home. He answered, angry, then afraid when I told him. He came down to the exchange in his overcoat and boots, hair wild from sleep, and found me still sitting with the cord in line 7. By then, the boy was gone. Mr. Bell tested the board, checked the rear connections, cursed the weather, and told me a crossed line had brought in some other child from another district. I asked why it came through line 7. He said electricity was a funny thing. Men often say a thing is funny when they cannot bear to call it frightening. He told me to make a note in the log and forget it. The next night at 2:13, line 7 lit again. This time I did not call Mr. Bell. I stared at the lamp until my eyes watered. Then I plugged in. "Number, please," I said, though my voice barely worked. The boy was already crying.
Miss, it's getting under the door.
"What is?"
The smoke.
Behind him, faintly, I heard crackling. Not static. Fire. I had heard enough chimney fires over the lines to know the sound. There was also another child crying somewhere farther away, a little girl by the sound of it. I said, "Samuel, where is your sister?"
Under the table.
"What is her name?"
Annie?
That matched, too. Annie Barlow had been 4 years old when she died. I asked him whether he could open a window. He said the window was hot. I asked where his father was. He said, the barn. I asked if he could crawl to the kitchen. He said the hall was full of smoke and the floor hurt his hands. Then he said something that made me take my headset off and sit with it in my lap until the night bell rang from another line and startled me nearly out of my chair. He said, "Why didn't you send someone yesterday?" The calls came every night after that, always at 2:13, always line 7, always Samuel in the burning house. At first, I tried to help him, as though the fire were happening then. I told him to wet a towel, crawl low, cover his mouth. I told him to keep his sister close. I told him to shout for his father. He listened politely, but nothing changed. The smoke was always in the hall. His mother would not wake. Annie was always under the table. He was always frightened. And then, after a few minutes, the line would go dead. I began going to the county library during the day. I read every clipping about the Barlow fire. It had started in the kitchen shortly after 2 in the morning. Kerosene stove, they thought. The father had been found outside near the barn, overcome while trying to reach the house. Mrs. Barlow was found in bed. Annie under the kitchen table. Samuel near the telephone. That detail had not been in the first article. It appeared only later in a smaller piece about the funeral. Samuel had died with the receiver in his hand. For 3 weeks, I answered him. For 3 weeks, I heard a child die every night. You may wonder why I did not quit. I wonder that, too. I think part of me believed that if I answered correctly, if I found the right words, If I could somehow understand what was being asked of me, the call would stop. Or perhaps I stay because when a child calls for help, even a dead child, decent people answer. Then, on April 4th, the call changed. Line 7 lit at 2:13. I plugged in. There was no coughing, no crackle of fire, no crying little girl, only Samuel breathing. I said, "Samuel?" He said, "It isn't for us tonight." I could feel my own pulse in the headset. "What do you mean?" "The fire." "What fire?" He gave me an address. Not the Barlow place, not anywhere near it. A house on Maple Street belonging to the Whitner family, 2 blocks from the church. I knew the house. I had connected Mrs. Whitner to her sister in Dayton just that afternoon. I rang the fire chief. He answered on the 4th ring and swore at me for waking him. I told him there might be a fire at the Whitner house. He asked who reported it. I looked at line 7 glowing on the board and said, "A child." He hung up. At 4:30 that morning, the Whitner house caught fire. They got everyone out, thanks be to God, but the kitchen was ruined and the upstairs hall blackened. The fire chief came to the exchange at 9 o'clock with soot still under his fingernails. He asked what exactly I had heard. I told him. He told me not to tell anyone else. For a while, the calls became warnings. Samuel would ring at 2:13 and give me an address. Sometimes it was a fire, sometimes a gas leak, once a man having a stroke, once a baby who had rolled face down in her blankets and would have smothered if I had not rung her mother's line until the poor woman woke furious and then began screaming. The town called me lucky, then uncanny. Then they stopped looking me in the eye. Mr. Bell told me to stop answering line 7. I asked if he would ignore it if a living child called for help. He said this was different. I said I did not know that it was. The last call came on November 19th, 1949. I remember the date because the first snow of the season had fallen that afternoon, and the streets below the exchange had gone quiet in the way only snow can make them quiet. At 2:13, line 7 lit. I had known all evening it would. There are nights when fear arrives early and sits beside you. I plugged in. "Number, please." Samuel said, "Miss Hart?" That was the first time he had ever used my name. I could not answer. He said, "I know where you live." I reached for the cord to pull it out, but my hand would not obey me. He said, "There is smoke in your hall." I stood so quickly my chair fell backward. I could see in my mind our little house on Mercer Street, my mother asleep in the front bedroom, the oil heater in the parlor, the rug by the stairs. I rang our number. Busy. I rang again. Busy. I rang the neighbor, Mrs. Lowe, and shouted at her to go to our house. Then I rang the fire chief. Then I ran. I do not remember leaving the exchange. I remember the stairs beneath my feet and the cold hitting my face. I remember slipping once on the street and tearing my stocking. I remember seeing smoke above Mercer Street before I turned the corner. The fire had started in our hall. My mother lived. Mrs. Lowe broke a window with a garden stone and climbed in like a woman half her age. The fire chief said another 5 minutes and both houses might have gone. The cause was never settled. A wire, they said, or the heater, or a coal that had popped from the grate, though we had no fire in the grate that night. I went back to the exchange the next morning and resigned. Mr. Bell did not try to stop me. Before I left, I looked at the board. Line 7 was dark. The little yellowed paper still read, "Disconnected." I married 2 years later and moved west. I raised children. I joined committees. I baked for church suppers. I became, by all outward signs, an ordinary woman. But I never answered a telephone after dark. My husband thought it was nerves. My children thought it was one of Mother's peculiarities. Everyone is permitted one or two. Last month, my granddaughter sent me a newspaper clipping from Mason County. The old exchange building was being torn down. There was a photograph of the room above Kessler's, empty now except for the switchboard, still standing against the wall like a dead organ in an abandoned church. I studied that photograph for a long time. Every lamp on the board was dark, except one. I knew its position. I knew it as well as I know the line in my own palm. Line 7 was still open. The telephone promised mankind a miracle. A voice without a body. A presence without a face. A person carried invisibly through copper and storm, arriving in the ear as if summoned by need alone. It is no wonder we welcomed it into our homes. It is also no wonder that some part of us remained afraid of it. There are inventions that do not create new ghosts, but give old ones a better road. Miss Hart's letter is one of the few I have read more than once. Not because it is the strangest. It is not. Not because it is the most violent. It is not that either. I return to it because of the terrible burden hidden inside it. Imagine being chosen as the person who must answer. Imagine discovering that mercy may be indistinguishable from a summons. Imagine hearing a child's voice and never knowing whether you are helping the living, comforting the dead, or serving something that has learned to imitate both. Our third and final letter for tonight is the longest of the three and the most difficult to introduce. It came from a woman who signed herself only as Margaret. No surname, no town. The envelope bore a Pennsylvania postmark, 1956. Inside was a wedding photograph, which I have kept with the letter. A young soldier stands beside his bride. He is smiling with the shy pride of a man not yet accustomed to happiness. She is looking at him instead of the camera. On the back, she wrote, "This was taken before he came home the first time." Here is her story. My husband came home from the war on a Thursday evening. His death notice arrived the following Monday. If you have never had the dead return before the letter saying they are dead, you may think joy comes first. It does not. Confusion comes first. Joy waits outside the door until the mind has decided whether it is safe to enter. His name was Daniel. We married in June of 1942, under a sky so blue it made everything seem blessed, even the war. He wore his uniform. I wore my sister's dress. At the reception, if it can be called that, we had lemonade, ham sandwiches, and a cake my mother made with rationed sugar she had saved for 6 months. Daniel danced with me in the church basement while his mother cried into a handkerchief and pretended she had something in her eye. He shipped out in August. His letters came regularly at first. He wrote about the food, the mud, the men in his unit, and once, in a rare moment of tenderness, about the way my hair smelled of lilac soap when I rested my head against his chest. I kept that letter under my pillow until the creases wore soft. Then the letters stopped. In February of 1945, 2 men came to the house. One was a captain, one was a chaplain. I saw them through the front window and knew before they touched the gate. Women learned the shape of bad news in those years. It wore polished shoes and carried its hat in its hands. They told me Daniel was missing in action. Not dead, missing. That word is a cruelty dressed as mercy. It lets grief into the house but refuses to give it a chair. I spent the next months neither wife nor widow, sleeping badly, eating when reminded, listening for footsteps that did not come. Then, on October 18th at 7 o'clock in the evening, Daniel knocked on the back door. I was in the kitchen peeling potatoes. Rain had been falling since noon, and the yard was black with mud. At first, I thought the sound was a branch hitting the porch roof. Then it came again. 3 knocks, slow, tired. I opened the door. He stood there in uniform. For a moment, I did not move. He was thinner, terribly thin. His cheeks had hollowed, and his eyes seemed set too deep. Rain ran from the brim of his cap. His coat was stained dark at the hem as though he had walked through a river. But it was Daniel, my Daniel. The small scar on his chin from a boyhood fall. The left ear that sat slightly lower than the right. The gentle, uncertain smile that always made him look as if he were asking forgiveness for being loved. He said, "Hello, Maggie." No one else called me that. I dropped the knife. I think I said his name. I think I touched his face. Then I was in his arms, or he was in mine, and the rain was coming into the kitchen, and I was crying so hard I could not breathe. He was cold. That was the first wrong thing, though not the first, I admitted to myself. Men coming home from war are permitted to be cold. They are permitted to be thin, quiet, changed, and strange. The living have always asked the returned to behave like the departed, and that is unfair. So I did not question his coldness. I made him sit by the stove. I took his coat. I put coffee on. I asked him where he had been. He said, "Farther than I meant to go." I thought he meant a hospital, a prison camp, some terrible march. I asked whether the army knew he was home. He looked at me oddly and said, "Not yet." I should have pressed him. I should have written someone. I should have gone next door for Mrs. Avery and asked her to look at him, too, to tell me whether joy had made me foolish. But I had my husband at the kitchen table after 8 months of absence, and I was not willing to share him with doubt. He would not eat. He held the coffee cup in both hands as though grateful for the heat, but he did not drink. I made eggs. He smiled and said he had eaten. I said he was lying. He said yes, probably. That almost made me laugh. It was such a Daniel answer, gentle, a little ashamed, full of love. That night I woke at 3 and found his side of the bed empty. He was standing in the hallway facing the front door. The moon was bright enough to silver the floorboards. Daniel stood barefoot in his undershirt and trousers, hands at his sides, head slightly bowed, as if listening to someone on the other side of the door. I called his name. He did not answer. I touched his arm, and he flinched so violently I stepped back. He said, "I thought I heard them." "Who?" He looked at the door. "No one." The next day, I told myself he was troubled by memories. I had read enough newspaper columns to know the war had sent men home with invisible injuries. I resolved to be patient. Patience felt noble, and nobility is a useful disguise for fear. Small wrongnesses gathered. The dog would not come near him. Jasper had adored Daniel before the war, slept under his chair, followed him to the barn, whined for 2 days after he left. Now Jasper crouched in the corner of the kitchen and growled whenever Daniel entered. Daniel seemed grieved by this. Once I found him kneeling with one hand extended, whispering, "It is me, old boy." The dog urinated on the floor and fled. Daniel cast a reflection, but not properly. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying he had no reflection, like some creature from a penny dreadful. He was there in the mirror, but there was a softness to him, a delay. When he lifted his hand, the man in the glass seemed to lift his a fraction too late. When he turned away, the reflection seemed reluctant to follow. He did not sleep. I would wake and find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Once, near dawn, I heard him whispering in the kitchen. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened. He said, "I came back. I told you I would." A pause, then lower. "No, not her." There was no answer I could hear. On Sunday, we went to church. Daniel insisted. He shaved carefully and wore his best suit, which hung loose on him. People stared when we entered. Mrs. Avery dropped her hymnal. Daniel's mother made a sound so terrible I still hear it when I dream. She crossed the aisle and took his face in both hands, saying, "Danny, Danny, Danny," like a prayer. He let her hold him, but his eyes went to the stained glass window above the altar, where Christ stood with one hand raised. During the first hymn, Daniel began to cry, not quietly, not like a man moved by worship. Tears ran down his face while he stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands gripping the pew until the knuckles whitened. I touched his sleeve. He whispered, "The bells hurt." There were no bells ringing then. The notice arrived Monday. I saw the government envelope in the mailbox and felt some animal part of me understand before the rest. Daniel was in the kitchen when I brought it inside. He looked at the envelope but did not ask what it was. His face folded inward, not with surprise, but with weariness. The letter said his remains had been recovered near a river crossing in Germany. Identification had been confirmed by his tags, dental records, and wedding ring. The ring was mentioned twice. I remember because by the time I read it the second time, I was staring at Daniel's left hand. He was wearing his wedding ring, the same dull gold band I had put on his finger in the church basement in June of 1942. The same tiny scratch near the edge where he had caught it on a nail while repairing my mother's porch before he shipped out. I sat down because my legs had become unreliable. Daniel said, "Maggie." I placed the letter on the table between us. He did not touch it. "Tell me," I said. He closed his eyes. "Tell me what you are." That hurt him. I saw it. Whatever else may be true, that hurt him. He said, "I am what made it back." I wanted to hate him then. Hatred would have been cleaner than love. But he looked so tired and so afraid, and so much like the boy who had danced with me under paper streamers while everyone pretended there was nothing to fear in the world. I asked, "Where is my husband?" He looked toward the front door. Some of him is there. I could not understand him, and yet I understood enough that I began to shake. He told me then, not all of it, and not in order. He said there had been water, cold water, black under shell smoke. He said men were calling for help in the dark. He said he had been hit or drowned or both. He was not sure. He remembered mud in his mouth and someone holding his wrist. Not a medic, not a soldier. Someone beneath the water. He said there were places where the dead gathered before they knew they were dead. Roads, rivers, stations, doorways. He said some waited there because they had nowhere to go. Some because they did not know the way. Some because they had promised to return and could not bear to break the promise. "And you?" I asked. "I promised you." That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the room seem very small. He said he had walked a long way. Not in miles. He could not explain it. He said he followed anything that sounded like home. Church bells. My voice in memory. The song from our wedding. Rain on a roof. He said others heard those things too. Others followed. I asked who. Daniel did not answer. That night I woke to knocking, not at the back door where Daniel had first returned, at the front. 3 knocks, slow, tired. Daniel was already standing in the hallway. I got out of bed and came to the top of the stairs. He stood below with one hand on the knob. His shoulders were bent as if someone had placed a great weight across them. "Do not open it," I said. He looked up at me, and I saw tears on his face. "They came with me." The knocking sounded again. 3 knocks. The door shook gently in its frame, not violently, politely. That was the horror of it. Whoever stood outside was not breaking in. They were asking. Daniel said, "I told them I could find the way." "Who?" He leaned his forehead against the door. "The ones who could not remember." I came down the stairs. I do not know why. Perhaps because fear becomes less bearable at a distance. I stood beside him and saw through the narrow glass pane beside the door shapes in the rain. At first I thought there were 3 or 4. Then lightning opened the road, and I saw them all. Soldiers, sailors, a nurse with one sleeve torn away, a boy in overalls who could not have been more than 15, an old woman in a black dress, men in uniforms I did not recognize, men in clothes from before my father was born, a little girl holding a doll by one leg, dozens of them, perhaps more beyond the gate, all wet, all pale, all facing the house, waiting. The nearest stood at the bottom of the steps. His face was ruined on one side, but the other was young and terribly hopeful. Daniel whispered, "They thought if I came home, they could too." I said, "This is not their home." He looked at me then. "No," he said, "but you opened to me." There are sentences that divide a life. Before them, after them. That was one. The knocking came again. I backed away from the door. Daniel did not. He placed his palm flat against it, and from the other side, many hands pressed back. I saw their shapes appear against the wet glass. Large hands, small hands, fingers spread in pleading. I began to pray. I had not prayed properly since the captain and chaplain came to the gate, but the words returned. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Daniel closed his eyes as if each word struck him. He said, "Maggie, I am so tired." I wanted to go to him. I wanted to pull him away, lock the door, close every curtain, and keep whatever piece of him had returned. But I understood then that love can become a door, too. And some doors, once opened, do not ask only one thing through. I said, "Are you my husband?" He turned from the door. For a moment he looked exactly as he had on our wedding day. Not thin, not pale, not delayed in the mirror or cold from some impossible road. Just Daniel, my Daniel. The shy smile, the kind eyes, the man who danced badly and apologized when he stepped on my shoe. He said, "Enough of him to love you." Then the porch light went out. I heard the door open. I did not see him turn the knob. I did not see him step through. Darkness took the hallway for perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 3 years. When lightning flashed again, the door was shut. Daniel was gone. So were the figures in the road. On the table by the door lay his wedding ring. I buried it in the churchyard, beneath the stone they gave him when the army sent his remains home. People said I was fortunate to have something of him returned. I did not argue. People are very fond of making grief tidy when it is not theirs. For 9 years, I have kept the front door locked after sunset. I have remarried no one. I have sold the house and moved twice. It does not matter. Every October 18th, rain comes whether the forecast calls for it or not. At 7 o'clock in the evening, there are 3 knocks at the front door. Slow, tired, polite. I do not open it. Last year, for the first time, the knocking was followed by Daniel's voice. Not outside the door, behind me. He said, "Maggie, I think some of them remembered your name." That is why I'm writing to you, Mr. Graves, not because I expect help, not because I expect belief. I'm writing because I have carried this alone for too long, and because October is coming again. If this letter reaches you after the 18th, then perhaps I opened the door. If it reaches you before, pray that I did not. There are many kinds of haunting. Houses, yes. Roads, certainly. Nurseries, telephone lines, windows, battlefields, and the dark mouth of a hallway after the lamps have been put out. But the most faithful hauntings are not attached to places. They attach themselves to promises. A promise is a door we build inside ourselves. We tell another person, I will return, I will answer, I will wait, I will love you always. Noble words, most of them. Necessary words. Human words. But one wonders, after reading a letter like Margaret's, whether certain promises are overheard by things that have no right to hear them. Tonight we have heard from a mother who learned that permission may be given without understanding it. From an operator who answered a line that should have been dead. And from a widow whose love may have guided her husband home by a road no living soul was meant to travel. I cannot tell you what they prove, perhaps nothing. Perhaps only that the world is stranger near the edges of grief, and that fear is most powerful when it uses the voices we trust. The letters will remain here in my files, along with the photograph Margaret enclosed. I will not describe it further except to say that Daniel does not look like a monster. That may be the cruelest part. The things that ruin us seldom arrive looking like monsters. More often they come as a voice at the window, a child on the line, a beloved figure standing in the rain. Some letters ask to be believed. Others ask only to be removed from the hand that wrote them. Tonight, I have read 3 such letters aloud. Whether that lightens their burden or merely passes it along, I cannot say. But if you are still listening, then I am afraid some part of them now belongs to you. This is Victor Graves, and you have been listening to The Lost Signal. Lock the door before you sleep, not because it will save you, because some things still prefer to be invited.